Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Juliana Ojeda. I am the Program and Operations Manager at Green 2.0. I am excited to welcome you to Environmental Workforce Ready, supporting young people of color. Young people of color are among the current and future leaders of the environmental sector, and as they enter the movement, we must ensure we provide them with the resources, tools, and programs that will not only set them up for success, but will help them thrive. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from young leaders of color in the movement on their journeys to enter the environmental sector and what we can continue doing as a movement to encourage more young people from historically marginalized communities to enter and stay in the environmental workforce. I have a few housekeeping notes before we start. Zoom captions are enabled for today's event. If you have questions throughout the event, please put them in the Q&A box. We will try our best to address all of your questions during the Q&A portion of the event, but we keep a log of questions and can follow up with you after. And lastly, you will receive an email by next week with a recording of the event. Before we begin, I want to thank all of today's panelists for their participation in this important discussion and all of you for attending today's event. I will now pass it over to our moderator, Jasmina, to start the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Juliana. Hi, everyone. My name is Yasmina. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the founder and co-director of Politics for Her. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you today. So we will start and go ahead with our panelists turning on their cameras so that they can introduce themselves, their pronouns, where they work, and perhaps briefly touch on their experience coming up as a young professional of color in the environmental sector. So perhaps we can start with you, Kiana.
Hi, I'm Kiana Spates. I go by they, them, theirs pronouns. I work for American Public Health Association as their program associate under their Climate Health and Equity Center. And my experience coming up as a young professional of color in the environmental sector has been very rough, I would say. Just from, I would say, it just being hard in general. I feel like when I did graduate from undergrad to get into the environmental sector, I felt like at the time, and I graduated during COVID, so there wasn't also like a lot of environmental jobs that I was particularly looking for out at the time. I would say it was very hard trying to find a job that fit, trying to find jobs that valued my experience as a professional of color, also being a genderqueer person, and just finding work environments that were safe for me to express my knowledge and contribute to a place as a whole. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing and for being so authentic and sincere. I think that all of us can relate, and how all different intersections and identities matter when it comes to finding a work environment that celebrates us and respects us. And maybe we can move to you, Alyssa.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa. I work with Solar United Neighbors. My pronouns are she, they. As far as my experience coming into this workforce, it's definitely been a learning curve for sure. I found a passion for climate justice when I learned about specific issues that were impacting my community. And I actually interned at Green 2.0 in, I think, 2021. All these years are kind of meshed together. So I think that was the year. But it's where I really developed a passion for uplifting and learning about issues that communities are facing, because as we all know, specific communities are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and what does climate justice actually look like when we're talking about it on the ground, and making specific solutions with communities. So I kind of interned, bounced around a lot. I interned at the Institute for Policy Studies, also at the ACLU, and I really was lucky to find a position at Sun where I kind of combined both of my passions for equity and program implementation. But like I said, it's definitely been a learning curve, and it has not been easy, and at times it has been emotionally taxing. But yeah, so I'm excited to dig in more into like the barriers and what tools and strategies we can offer.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And I love how the personal is political. What really drives you is the community that you serve. I relate and resonate with that a lot. Thank you. And last but surely not least, Kira.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Kira Jones. I use she, her pronouns. For me, it has been a relatively new journey. I graduated just about a year ago now from Ohio State. That was where I studied environmental policy and public policy analysis. After a bit of trial and error in undergrad, I realized that I really had a passion for environmental justice work and long term want to work in environmental politics and the environmental law space. So after graduating, I also did an internship with Green 2.0, which was just an amazing introduction to like what the environmental sector looks like and kind of what different outlets and opportunities there are within it. And then from there, I got to intern with the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which was really cool as well, getting that like firsthand experience in environmental politics. And now I work full time with Climate Power as a research associate. So yeah, it's been about a year, a little less, but definitely learning more about what the sector looks like and kind of what the actual day in and out work consists of in this field.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It's been a year, but you've accomplished so much. It's so impressive. Congratulations with all of that. So, something that we've touched upon a bit is how the environmental workforce can very often present unique challenges for young people of color in particular. It can range from systemic barriers to lack of representation. And what specific challenges have you faced or have you seen your peers, and how have you seen your peers face, and how can we address them through an intersectional approach within the movement? And perhaps we can start with Kiana.
Yeah, so I would say a big one, speaking for my own identity, being a Black person, like in the environmental sector, I feel like something I've experienced and noticing from what my peers have experienced is learning how to navigate workspaces safely and learning when to ask for the pay raise or, ask for the promotion or kind of like learning, when you're like getting into that entry level job or that mid-level job, um, when to speak up about like what's important that you have to say. And I feel like a lot of the times imposter syndrome within the environmental space as a Black person comes up a lot, and that's due to a lot of systemic barriers and lack of representation. Because I feel like I personally have not seen a lot of Black people in the environmental sector who are not considered like working on the ground, but more in like higher up or like big named green organizations. So I would say it's just been like a lack of representation, a lack of like motivation for, there are more experienced professionals of color being in other organizations that are not as like grassroots, kind of like doing that like mentorship or kind of like that helping with the transition for young professionals of color. Because I will say when it comes to the environmental sector, there's a lot of navigating it by yourself. And I would say it's very lonely in a sense and having to always hunt for your own resources, I would say. And I would say like how these can be approached in the movement is kind of addressing those lack of representations in those big green organizations, connecting more with young folks of color, not doing nepotism when it comes to jobs, and actually, giving young people of color a chance to actually express the knowledge that they've also had to fight through in undergrad in their master's program. And I feel like a lot of barriers I've also experienced is like when applying for these types of jobs, I'm always overthinking like, am I qualified enough to apply for this? And I know there was like a statistic out there that like white men apply to 60% of jobs that they're not even qualified for, or 40% of like women or people of color don't. So I think there needs to be an encouragement to apply to these positions, showing on the employer side that this is a safe space for young people of color to kind of like enter this field of work. And there needs to be more effort into showing that it is a safe space for young professionals of color to share their knowledge, share their worth within the space, and maybe like within the interview process, giving them examples of how, that type of support looks like within their organization. So.
Thank you for sharing. You mentioned the lack of representation, and not just any kind of representation, but also at the highest levels, of course, the lack of mentorship, and sometimes that there's nepotism, and of course, imposter syndrome that a lot of young people, particularly young people of color and gender minorities, deal with. And I really like the approach of more friendly and inclusive recruitment. I believe that we have to align with what we preach in every sense of the way. What about you, Alyssa? Do you want to share with us?
Sure. First of all, I agree with everything that is being said. And I think one of the things I have faced or seen my peers face is being paid a livable wage. As we know, like people of color are often get paid less than their white counterparts. And we also know that people of color experience specific challenges and barriers when applying for these jobs or internships. And this is not only, I think, exclusive to the environmental movement. I think it's nonprofit overall, and we see a lot of people leave the sector because they're just not being paid a livable wage. And for internships specifically, I think internships often offer too little pay. And when we think about people who cannot do these internships because they pay too little, it's often like people who don't have that financial cushion, right? Like they need but then when they want to enter the workforce, these job descriptions are requiring that they have that experience. So it's kind of like it's a contradicting. So I think one of the main things we need to do is start offering livable wages and a good quality benefits. And I think we also need to start redefining what experience means. I think lived experience absolutely counts. And I believe people closest to the problem often have the solutions on how to address these issues and approach the work in a meaningful and intentional way. So I think we need to redefine what experience means, and we need wages to reflect the current cost of living, right? I think young people in particular are entering the workforce with high rent costs, massive student loan debt, high utility costs. Like it is definitely not fun, especially when you're starting to build your financial momentum, trying to put money into savings, but you're not really making enough to do that. And also like you want to have fun on the weekends too, right? Like you should be able to, I don't know, do a baking class without breaking the bank, like, so it's really time that we advocate like for better wages, and that workplaces are actually offering that. So I think that would be the major barrier and challenge that I have seen.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It just shows how elitist the nonprofit sector remains and exclusive. And young people deserve good wages. They deserve benefits. They deserve to live in a society that celebrates them and where they're not worried of living paycheck to paycheck on top of having those loans. And as you said, lived experiences should count as an experience, because a lot of entry-level positions, they also require an early experience for up to 5 years, and it makes no sense. So thank you for sharing that. And next, I would like to ask Kira. You mentioned how you transitioned from school to work, and that can be very uncertain, right? Especially when you never had a job or don't necessarily have supports. Previously, it was mentioned that there's also lack of mentorship. So what resources or strategies have helped you during your transition from graduating to the workforce?
Yeah, thank you so much. I also want to just highlight everything that the other panelists said are so important, definitely resonating with all of that. But yeah, from my experience personally, I do feel like I really leaned on being a part of organizations that were both based into the environmental sector. So organizations like the Black Oak Collective, which is based out in DC, as well as just really talking with the other interns in my different cohorts. Um, Kind of what was touched on before, it can feel very isolating when you're in these spaces and no one else looks like you, or you're kind of going through whether it's these financial challenges being an intern, or it's just like that imposter syndrome of being in spaces where you're like, I'm not really sure if my past experiences match up with what they're expecting here. So I've kind of found that like this idea of networking horizontally has been really helpful because at the end of the day, a lot of times the other people that are in the spaces as you, or like your peers that are also trying to get into these positions within the environmental sector, are dealing with the same issues that you are. And so kind of building that community has definitely helped me kind of feel a little bit safer in the spaces that I'm in, kind of affirmed where I'm at in my career and like my career path in general. I would also say that like mentorship, although it can be a little difficult to find a mentor that really like connects with you personally and also is has a good like mutual relationship, mentorship has really helped me. I feel like having someone who's either in a space that you eventually want to be in or has gone through the experiences that you have will really allow you to kind of have a safe person to talk to and kind of understand what you guys are going through and have someone to kind of talk through the processes that you've been through. So that has definitely been really helpful for me as well.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. Alyssa, would you like to add anything to that? And even Kiana, if you want.
Sure. I guess like one thing that helped me transition into the workforce, I was graduating school and I needed a job very quickly. And sometimes, I think you put in like 30 applications and you only receive like 2 calls back, right? Like that's just the norm. So I think one thing that gave me confidence was learning how to write a resume and a cover letter. I had the resources at my university, fortunately, so I was able to go and ask them a bunch of questions about how can I really promote myself and really celebrate my accomplishments and advocate for myself during these interviews and what follow-up questions should I be asking. And I also think what helped me was asking people who I had worked with or interned for about their experience. I think they provided really helpful tips and suggestions about what I should be looking for, what I need to be staying away from. And they kind of helped me align like what I was looking for. So I think those are the 2 things that helped me transition into the workforce.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And Kiana, perhaps we can focus a little bit on an aspect that you mentioned before, which is mentorship. So having a network of support mentors and sponsors is really major key to ensuring that young people of color particularly enter this sector and have access to social capital that will set them for success. What role has mentorship played in your career journey, if any?
Yeah, I would say mentorship for me has kind of made me transition out of that like young college mindset to like, okay, you're like a functioning adult. You need to start thinking about these different things. Um, I would say like my first official, and to be honest, like I've had different mentors throughout my life, I feel like, who have been beneficial and who have not been beneficial, to be honest. I had mentorships and advisors in college, and I went to basically like an all white women's college in Virginia. And my advisor, I felt like at the time would not encourage me to like apply to certain things or kind of like trying to stay within my boundaries or framework, or basically saying don't reach for the stars when it comes to certain things. And then I realized that you have to be particular about who you have in your corner. Um, Especially as a young professional of color, because the advisor at the time was a white person. And what I found through my own personal experiences that people will try to hinder you and try to put barriers on you because they don't think the most of you. And that kind of leads to that whole like imposter syndrome, like, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't apply to this, maybe I shouldn't apply to that. And then I was able to do a program, and the program was called Mentorship for Environmental Scholars. And it was a program for people of color who were in like the sciences and STEM fields. And I think that was the first time I was able to be in a setting like that. And our mentor was a Black man, and he was basically giving us like the ins and outs on how to like do a resume, how to write a cover letter, how to like negotiate pay, how to ask for benefit packages, how to network. And I feel like mentorship has taught me how to network because naturally I seem loud, but I'm very shy. And when it comes to like big networking spaces, I feel like I feel very intimidated, especially if I don't know if there are other people who share my identity or people who are like the same age as me. Because most of the time when I'm in networking spaces, it seems like a lot of experienced folks or whatever you consider experience, right? And I think at the time I didn't really consider like Alyssa was saying, like my lived experience as experience, all the things that I've encountered now being like a environmental justice advocate and how that applies to my work now. I don't think I consider that as being experience. And just having to mentors from that program that I participated in, I feel like helped me gain a lot of confidence. Mentorship is really great, especially when you need letters of recommendation when you're trying to apply to different jobs, or if you're even trying to like apply to different programs of study if you want to further your knowledge in school. So I would say it's helped me like gain my confidence. It's helped me learn how to navigate workspaces and understanding. I know how to navigate a space where I feel like I don't feel too safe in, and I know how to navigate a space where I feel like, oh, okay, my voice feels heard here. I know how to navigate that. Um, so I would say like mentorship has helped me learn how to be a functioning working adult, if you would say. But I'm very grateful for mentorship. And even like I also don't consider like everyone who may have been in the field longer than me as a mentorship. Sometimes I consider my peers as mentorships just based off different experiences that they've had. And I consider one of my friends that I met in graduate school when I went to American as a mentor for me because she's come from a different background, but she has like so much knowledge. And I feel like it's good to also value knowledge horizontally, not always like vertically. So I would also say like value your peers' knowledge as well. And there's nothing wrong with centering your peers or centering your friends if they have knowledge on how to access social capital, access resources that you might need for the future. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that's what I keep from all of that is that the type of mentorship that you seek is just as the places that you go that needs to celebrate you, right? It's not any type of mentorship. It has to be somehow someone you can relate to or that has similar intersectionalities and identities. And also when it comes to early career supports, it's not necessarily something that we are taught in universities when it comes to cover letter and resume and LinkedIn profile. So I'm curious to know, Kira, about you who has graduated a year ago. What has mentorship played in your career journey? Did you learn how to write a cover letter and a resume through university, or did you have to seek outside of that?
Yeah, thank you. I was very fortunate in undergrad to be able to do a program where we were basically set up with a mentor, and my mentor was another Black woman in the environmental legal space. So it was very much like, oh, what you're doing is exactly what I want to do. And having conversations with her really helped me have a better understanding of like what that sector looks like, different opportunities that may be beneficial or maybe detrimental to my eventual like career goals, as well as she really allowed me to connect with other people, which I feel like is also super important when you have a mentor, is don't be afraid to ask them if they know anyone else who may also be able to mentor you. You never really know what type of knowledge someone can bring to you or what advice or opportunities. So kind of expanding on that too, I guess what I'll add in terms of mentorship is because so much of this past year for me has been doing internships. a big part of that was really just taking advantage of talking to anyone and everyone, right? So as even though internships themselves can be kind of exhausting and you're going to have long days, when you're in these spaces, it is really important to just take a second to talk to everyone in your office, in your division, whoever it may be. Go to the events, depending on where you're at. There may be like events within the environmental sector, and just really just be cognizant and like intentional about putting your career goals in mind, because again, you never know when you're going to meet someone who could be helpful to you, who could, you know, provide that advice on the LinkedIn profiles or the resumes or the interview skills. Another thing that I would say too is even just look within your family. Although I am the only person who works in the environmental sector within my immediate family, I did have like uncles and like god family and whatnot that are very progressed in their careers, and so they were able to provide me with advice as well. Like something like writing a resume is pretty universal, so even though they may not be, you know, a lawyer or whatever, they were still able to look over my materials and help me get into those spaces. And even if it's not just family, maybe you have a friend who has a family member, or maybe someone at your school that's like a professor. Like at the end of the day, you never really know who will have good advice for you, so just don't be afraid to ask is my advice.
Yeah, networking can take you to places where your experience and your degrees might not. And I really like this perspective of really taking advantage in building meaningful relationships, whether it be with mentors, with professionals, friends, family, anything. I love that. My next question is going to be addressed to Alyssa. So, as we just spoke about, knowledge and access to resources can play a very important role in career development for young people. What are some of the tools and resources that have been particularly helpful in your career journey so far?
I am going to try to answer this question as best as I can. I think what was important for me was to examine the purpose of my role and reflect on what impact I wanted to make within the organization, and communicate that to with my manager. And I think a tool that was particularly helpful for me was creating a career development plan within my role. So that made sure I was tracking my goals for each quarter and also for the year. And when creating this, I made sure to keep in mind a work-life balance and my capacity. So I actually wanted to assess like what is actually feasible within my role and what is something that needs to go on the back burner. And I think another tool and resource that helped me was learning how to facilitate meetings, create effective agendas, and receive and provide feedback. There's a really great organization that Solar United Neighbors uses. It's called the Management Center. I don't know if anybody else here has heard of it, but they offer free templates on how to approach your work and make it more equitable, sustainable, and create the biggest external and internal impact. So if people are looking for resources and templates, I really recommend the Management Center. They offer free tips and templates on how to approach your work. And I would love to hear from the other panelists if they have any specific like strategies or tools.
That was great. Thank you so much for sharing. And next, we're going to go towards Kiana, who mentioned having worked in environments that were not necessarily friendly or inclusive. So creating an inclusive workplace is really essential for the retention and success of young professionals, particularly young professionals of color. So in your opinion, how can organizations and employers in the environmental sector create a more inclusive and supportive work environments for young people of color, which you have mentioned a bit before about the recruitment processes, but perhaps we can talk more about the day-to-day here.
Yeah, so I've experienced different types of strategies within environmental sectors on how to kind of like approach like DEIJ, and kind of like create these inclusive spaces from a range of like doing like affinity groups, having support like that, from, you know, celebrations of like different months, and things like that. But to be honest, I feel like a lot of DEIJ strategies and trying to create inclusive spaces for young professionals of color kind of stop at like the staff level, and I feel like it needs to be in the higher level as well. It needs to be practiced throughout the company. So I would say like day to day, in terms of like an employer trying to make your young professional of color feel like safe and heard, making sure like just like simple things like when you're in a meeting or something, making sure there's space for your young professional of color to talk, and not making them seem like since they are entry level professional that they don't have anything important to say, and making sure that that safe space is created, not allowing people to talk over them, allowing them to get everything that they need out. Also making sure that there's maybe like weekly check-ins to see how they're doing, see how they're navigating. It's one thing, and I've been on teams like this before. I'm the only person of color on a team. And I'm having to, like, your day-to-day interactions with your supervisor, your boss can be pleasant, but having to navigate other interactions within your company, within your organization can be taxing. Um, and making sure that you are supporting that your young professional of color, backing them up when they're telling you their experiences. If you do a check-in, so they saying that they're experiencing these weird microaggressions from a different coworker within the organization, making sure that you're backing them up, and not making them feeling like they're alone and having to kind of like navigate weird interactions by themselves. So I would say, I feel like, especially for me, I feel like the most important part when it comes to kind of like creating an inclusive support is learning or knowing that your team and your organization or your supervisor has your back, and it's not really kind of like sending you off to HR or something to kind of like figure out why you were feeling like, you know, you were being talked over by a man, or why you feeling like no one wants to hear your voice because you're Black, or a person of color. So I would say trying to make sure that you're creating a supportive relationship um, with your young professionals of color, with your staff of color, and making sure they actually feel supported, making sure they know what resources are available to them. When it comes to approaching HR with an issue, making sure that they are talking to them about language, about how to navigate that situation. Because a lot of the times I felt like in past situations, I was trying to figure out how do I navigate this language about something that I've just experienced, and making sure it's heard how I want it to be heard, and not heard in a sense of what would be best for the company, as so to speak. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned those micro actions, but that make a huge difference and creates a supportive community more than just like having a workplace, and more than seeing just people as, you know, like working individuals, but seeing them more as a whole, as a person with different identities, with a different background. It's really key and important if we really want to create an inclusive environment. And coming to that, young people of color like ourselves, they very often face so many microaggressions and challenges. So learning to advocate for yourself in the workplace is really crucial. And it's not necessarily taught to us, you know, sometimes we're silenced at first when we face those microaggressions. So to all of you, how have you successfully advocated for yourself in your career? And what advice would you give to others in ensuring that their voices are heard and valued? And perhaps we can start with Kira.
Yeah, I feel like, to be honest, this is something that I'm still working on now. I've been in my current role since January, so it's been like 5 going on 6 months, excuse me. Um, I would say being on the job, I've definitely learned a lot more about like my communication skills and my work style. And it's definitely different, you know, going from undergrad and being in like relatively like individual or group projects, but like it's for a grade, like there's a very definitive like end goal and insight. Whereas working in like a full-time position now where I'm working on projects that could go on for months, and it's kind of like, okay, where is this going? And like how does this kind of tie in with like the day-to-day? So I would say definitely taking time to kind of reflect on what how are you feeling on a daily, weekly basis, like internally, and kind of figuring out, okay, like where are spaces that I feel like I either one am not being fully like connected with like my coworkers or my boss, like where areas that I'm seeing like I feel like there's some type of miscommunication. And then two, also just kind of looking at in terms of your work, really reflecting on like if you feel like your day-to-day work is aligned with like your organization's goals as well. I feel like it can be hard being in a new position and you're new to everything and there's new people and new projects and it's also your first time working. So you're really like, I don't know what this looks like. But just really taking time to constantly check in with yourself and really thinking about, okay, how can I improve? How can I better communicate what I'm feeling? And I would also say that communication aspect can be really hard and can be daunting. So this kind of goes back to that mentorship piece of like talking with other people that you have already built a mentorship relationship with and kind of asking them for guidance on how to communicate how you may be feeling if there are any issues within your workplace, or also just talking with your peers, whether they're at the org that you're working at or at a different organization, kind of asking them like what their experiences have been. Because again, you'll never know what type of like advice that they may be able to provide you with as well, because they may be like in a similar position that you have. So yeah, definitely feel like it's important to just take time and reflect individually on what some of those issues are, and then also if you can kind of ask other people for advice on how to best communicate that, because it can be a really daunting task to talk to someone at a new organization and tell them an issue that you're experiencing with or some type of change that you'd like to make, especially if you're brand new. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That was very wise. And Alyssa, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I'm still learning too. It is a journey. I guess one piece of advice I wish I could have told myself when I was doing my internships and when I was maybe like 2 or 3 years ago was that I have the right to take up space wherever I am. And I think as I was entering the environmental sector, I wasn't as vocal because like I'm someone who struggles with anxiety, right? So I was scared that I was going to mess up pitching the idea, or I don't know, I would like compare myself to others and be like, oh, that idea is great. Let's just go with that idea. And then I don't have to speak. And in some cases, I was in rooms with people who did not look like me, who did not have the same values in terms of like equitable practices. And also some of these people were making triple or quadruple of what I made, right? So I was like, I don't really think this is this is the great time to pitch things. But um I think I had to learn like I have the right to take up space. And I think workplaces also really need to learn to create an environment where people feel like they have the right to say what they need to say and pitch ideas and be have a collaborative environment. So like I think workplaces need to show up. I think managers need to show up, and they have an equal responsibility in doing their part to making sure that people are just being their authentic selves, right? And they're being heard and they're being valued.
Yeah, I really like that. And also, it builds on what Kira mentioned about self-reflection and advocating for yourself and speaking up. And it takes time and it takes practice and a lot of energy and efforts, but we're getting there. And Kiana, do you want to add anything about how to advocate for yourself in the workplace?
Yeah, I am a big advocate of making sure that you're being authentic in a space. Um, Also because, and also making sure that you're like valuing your own voice as much as you would evaluate, maybe you have like an environmental justice like crush within the movement or something, someone abused to value their voice, you need to make sure that you value your own voice. Um, I think I've always had a hard time not being authentic in a space. I have a hard time with being in spaces and workspaces that don't value like how loud I am or how like dramatic with my hands I can be, or like when I'm always been the outspoken one, as people like to call it, but I'm very much an advocate for taking up space, also knowing when to listen and also knowing when to center yourself as well. And honestly, in terms of communication styles when advocating for yourself, I learned this from Green 2.0 from doing the fellowship with them, doing the when working with me document. And it kind of list out the things like when working with me, like this is what you should know about me. This is the type of communicator that I am. For me, like I'm a very like direct communicator. I like to get straight to the point when it comes to like meetings. I also like to get straight to the point, like what are we talking about here? What are the action items that are coming out of this? Like, so I would really encourage for you or any person of color who's in a entry level position to figure out some type of document like that and express to your employer, this is how you can work with me, because I'm also a very anxious person. But I'm anxious into the fact where I will have something to say, but I will be nervous until that certain point comes. So I'm just kind of like patiently waiting on when to say something. And unless I'm like encouraged to ask, I'll probably be there sitting as well. So like Alyssa was saying, like it's kind of like up to the workplace to kind of like encourage those environments for people to feel safe, to even advocate for themselves or to speak up for themselves. But yeah.
Thank you. That was really beautiful. And we mentioned earlier the issue of representation, right? So it goes a long way to make young professionals of color feel less isolated in the workplace. As a movement, as a climate justice movement, how can we create intentional spaces for more established professionals of color in their career to be in the same rooms with younger professionals? And Kara, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, so I can share my perspective as someone who graduated undergrad and was going through that job search process. I definitely feel like one thing that would really help is individuals that are in more established positions making time and space for young professionals or even just young people in general looking to learn more about the movement to really connect and build those relationships. I can say from personal experience and from talking with other people kind of on the same level as me, we're very eager to get into this movement. We're very interested in learning more about what these big organizations are doing, what these nonprofits, what these grassroots orgs are doing as well. And a lot of times, what that barrier can be is one, getting access to be able to talk to individuals in these spaces. And then, after you even get that initial access, kind of having that follow up because it can be like quote unquote easy to like send an email to someone, but actually being able to hear back from them and start a conversation and know that like that individual is like looking out for you or is willing to talk to you is a lot harder. So I would say for any person of color or even just any individuals in these organizations with an established role, making yourself available to younger people is incredibly helpful. We are at the end of the day really looking for support and guidance. And I promise we're like super eager to talk. We want to learn more about what you're doing. So yeah, just as long as you're making yourself available, that's really helpful. And then again, if you can, going to events even and like just being open and willing to speak to young people. I feel like there's so many different networking events and different environmental focused events as well. So just taking a little bit of time to show up at these events and be supportive for younger people is like very helpful for us as well.
Yeah, and I saw Kiana nodding a lot. Do you want to add to this point?
No, I agree with everything that Kira is saying. Like more established professionals of color, like I very much so encourage like making yourself more available, whether that's like having some program within your organization that you're like reaching out and doing outreach at colleges and seeking out young professionals of color, doing that at the younger level too, because the youth movement is very lively in the environmental justice sector, the climate justice sector. Even going to like high schools, going to go talk when they're having career days, like show face, like when there's a bunch of summits going on around climate justice, environmental justice, go show face, make it a point to, you know, show that there are people of color like within the movement. But yeah, everything that Karen was saying, I agree with tenfold.
Yeah, and I hope that if there are any professionals of color in this call, that they're taking notes. We have one last question before we move into the Q&A. Young people very often feel pressure to go above and beyond when entering the workplace to show their commitment to a job, which can very often lead to burnout. how have you managed to balance your personal life while establishing yourself as a new young professional in the environmental sector? And do you have any advice towards self-care and mental health practices for our audience? Anyone wants to open up?
I can go.
Go ahead.
Take that paid time off, take those sick days for mental health days. Honestly, like the work will be there once you get back, obviously, because this is ongoing work. Um, I say to keep a life balance when it's time. Like I know like remote jobs are starting to be like a big push now, especially within this field. When it's time to close the laptop, close the laptop. I also advocate for if you are working from home, making sure that you creating spaces to work and spaces to relax within your home, and make those designated areas as that. I also advise to do your work outside sometimes and get some sunlight, because being inside so much can just feel like you gotta be head deep, and like it can drain your energy, and then you walk outside and you're like, wow, like I haven't been outside. And vitamin D is important, so sometimes like maybe doing that or doing like co-working with your friends and kind of like co-working in a space. In office sets, I would say there's like a lot of work that needs to be done and you're feeling like there's like a lot of things pulling you at different directions. I would say kind of like blocking off times where you're not doing meetings and things like that, and you're not having to do a lot of face-to-face interaction so you can get your work done. I would also say if you are working in the office, to make sure you stretch in the office. I know my job just started doing these like little stretching planning periods like every other week. So look into things like that, especially also look into your benefit packages if you are working in the office and you're like having to sit down and it kind of really like weighs on your body having to do like a lot of like office work. Look into your benefit packages because there's a lot of massage benefits that you can get into that you can use for your own benefit and your own health and well-being. Um, and I think something for me is like if I've had a very like anxious day at work, I like to download and not just be on any technology at all, or I like to journal, or I like to go outside and go eat with friends and kind of like talk about what's been going on in my life that you really feel like you can't talk about in work, but it kind of comes up in your body at work. So making sure that you are creating a support system around you, especially in this line of work, because it can be daunting sometimes being in the environmental sector. So making sure you have different outlets of support and that you're using your benefits, and don't let jobs make you feel bad for using your benefits, I would say. So.
Yeah, I love that. Take time for yourself, drop the computer and electronics when it's time off, get a massage, do some yoga, stretch, get some sun, work outside, like live your life, basically. Don't forget that you are more than your job, you are more than your title, and that you deserve to have a healthy and balanced life. That's a beautiful way to end the first segment of the webinar, and we will now move on to 10 minutes of Q&A. And I see that the chat is on fire and we have so many questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to answer all of them, but let's start by Victoria said, it's so validating to hear your experiences. I really resonate with you all. It's great to see others like me working within this field. I have just started a job within this field, but what are some ways I can still continue momentum as a young professional? Or that you all try to do to stay connected and continue learning within this field? That's a great question. Does anyone want to, maybe Alyssa, you want to answer?
Sorry, I'm still reading the question.
No problem. Take your time.
I think for me, something that I try to do to stay connected and continue learning within the field is, I think I'll be honest and say I love podcasts. So I usually have that running in the background while I work. And that is one of the ways I continue learning, not just within the environmental field, but also implementing that intersectional approach, right? So learning like what is happening today, and take care of yourself while you're doing that because that can also be emotionally draining. So I think that's something that I try to do to keep learning. And also, I'm very fortunate that my workplace offers a professional development stipend so I can continue to invest in myself and grow my skills.
That's awesome. I also love podcasts. I listen to podcasts every day, so I love that. We also have another really interesting question. I would love to hear from panelists how to implement lived experiences and personal interests in a cover letter. I struggle with presenting as professional and highlighting technical legal skills while also showcasing personal passion and lived experiences that impact my desire to work in the environmental field. And perhaps, Kiana, you can answer because you definitely spoke about lived experiences. Have you ever had a way to incorporate that within your professional setting?
Yeah, I also sometimes have an issue with the word professional because it can be very elitist at times, and it can often make you feel like you can't bring in that lived experience. Um, but honestly, I feel like if your lived experience is speaking to the work that they are doing, then I highly suggest like adding it into your cover letter and just make it like just use it as a learning experience that you went through that would have prepared you for whatever skill that they're asking you to do, whatever task that they're asking you to do, and how that helped elevate your knowledge to move forward. And also emphasizing on how your lived experiences, especially with the environmental sector, environmental justice field, a lot of the field is lived experiences, so also making sure you're highlighting that this I'm able to connect to this work because I had that lived experience.
Yeah, definitely. We have another really interesting questions from Carrie, and Carrie is saying, I'm hearing that everyone on the panel has degrees. Will you have any suggestions for people who do not want to or cannot afford a degree path? Is it possible to work in the environmental field without a degree? Kira, maybe you want to answer since you recently graduated. Perhaps you have some insights.
Yeah, I definitely feel like there's space for anyone and everyone within the sector. I would say the first thing that comes to my mind is the new climate core that was just introduced. I feel like that's a really good introduction to the space. Again, I would just definitely recommend reaching out to organizations and kind of see what opportunities are available. I definitely think with some digging, you'll be able to find access to a job that definitely fits with the work that you're trying to do right now with where your education level is at as well. So like I said, I feel like everyone has a space in this movement. So yeah.
That's awesome. And building on that, someone else is asking, what would you recommend to people who want to get involved in the environmental justice work, but don't necessarily have a background in that work, at an entry-level job and wanting to get involved in this line of work? Anyone would like to answer that?
I can go. I would say that we also need to understand that a lot of things are interconnected, and just because you're not in the environmental sector doesn't mean that it's not connected to the environmental sector in some case. So if you're someone who likes to do communications, there's a lot of communications and social media support that goes into the environmental sector. Like if you're in the business route, there's a lot of sustainable corporate business avenues that you can get into. I think it's just being able to know how to use your background and your knowledge from other fields and bring it to the forefront in the environmental sector, because there's always a avenue for different things in the environmental sector, and that's why I love it so much, because you can literally bring in any type of experience and come into the environmental sector with. Because I know I've had past friends who were more so into policy and politics and things like that. And they're just like, well, I really like the environment. I'm just like, there's so much environmental policy that needs to be advised. We need so many voices on trying to get, more environmental policy push that is more just, that is more rooted in environmental justice. So it's just thinking about the skills that you have and kind of like also learning how to research different things in the environmental sector, because honestly you don't know until you just do like a quick search. And also making sure once getting into the field, I would also advise like networking with people who are in the environmental sector, because I'm sure they have like a lot of advice to give when it comes to the transitioning from not being in the environmental sector into the environmental sector.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, everything is interconnected. So there is a way to connect all different industries with the environmental justice sector. And also, adding up to that, it's very often based on the skills that you have as an individual more than the degree or the background. So really believe in yourself. And if you want to get into a field, you can, as long as you put in the work. As our beautiful panelist mentioned, with mentorship, with going to events, showing up, you have to put on the hard work. So I'll pick one last question since we only have 3 minutes left. As a woman of color, I feel like I have a tendency to take on or want to take on as many roles as possible to add my credibility in this space. How do you all recommend maintaining a proper balance between trying to grow and not overworking yourself? I think that's so important. And maybe Alyssa, since you've mentioned a little bit about listening to podcasts and balancing and all of that, perhaps you have insights on that?
Yeah, I think it's really hard, right? I think, you know, as people of color and women of color, there is like this unspoken labor that you take on more because you're trying to like build up your reputation, and also your counterparts may not be taking up work, right? Because like they already have that, or like it's just like this internalized instinct that we have. So I definitely resonate with it, and I sympathize. And I think for me, how I've been trying to balance it is I've had to really unlearn this habit myself and really tie it into this larger like white supremacy culture and quote unquote professionalism culture, right? That's all tied to white supremacy. So I think for me, I've it's a journey, right? So for me, I really just had to try to unlearn it, and everybody's going to go through this in different ways. But I think the first step is saying no, and making boundaries within yourself, and it will be hard, but I think it's worth it because you deserve to feel exceptional no matter what kind of work you're doing, how little, how much, but prioritize a work-life balance. Do not put more hours in the day, and do not be doing stuff that is above your pay grade.
And that's a beautiful way to end this amazing discussion. Thank you so much for sharing with us all of your experiences, your insights. It's extremely valuable. Thank you to the audience for attending, for engaging with us. And there's a lot of hope when we see young people of color like yourselves getting engaged in the sector. And I have all confidence that with young people like yourselves, we will be able to bring systemic, structural, and sustainable change. So thank you again for everyone who has joined us, and make sure to follow Green 2.0 everywhere so that you can keep in touch, and a recording will be sent to your email. Have a great rest of your day.